Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 15th treatise delivered this 14th day of June 2020. Our topic today shall basically be about the tiff between the judiciary and the executive, which we know is one of the major current issues in Kenya today. I want to start by recollecting one of my personal experience during my practice as an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. I remember the year 2018, and that was an interesting year given the fact that we were just a few months after the protracted general election and principally the presidential election that had thrown the country into turmoil. There were riots, and of course subsequently there came the handshake that generated peace. Remember also that prior to that we had a series of IEBC riots, and the sum total of all this is that the economy was in a really downtown stream. So many businesses were suffering, and it is within that context that in around September of 2018, the issue of the of the finance bill 2018 came into force, bearing in mind that the provisions of the Finance Act 2013 now had to come in place, given the window that had been in place had effluxed, and the consequence of that was that the finance ministry, as it were, imposed the 16% VAT on petroleum products, and the net consequence of that was the effecting of that decision by both the KRA, that's the Kenya Revenue Authority, and the Energy Regulatory Commission, in the sense that petroleum product prices arose so suddenly. Of course, the consequence was that there was that widespread cry, there was hue and cry from different segments of the country, from different sectors, be it the manufacturing sector under the Kenya Manufacturers Association, be it the Central Organization of Trade Union, be it the Matatu sector. And I recall vividly at that time that as a lawyer I sat down, and of course with friends and so many other people with whom I cooperate, and through the Sumawe Youth Group we managed to file a petition, and that was constitutional petition number 19 of 2018, the case of Sumawe Youth Group against the cabinet secretary in charge of Treasury, as well as the Energy Regulatory Commission. And it's important to note that that was a time of vacation. Judges were on vacation, and I cannot forget, as we presented our matter before Justice Riechi, that was at the Bungoma High Court, because Kisumu High Court, in which it had been filed, it's only the Bungoma High Court that was operating then within the Western region. And of course, we managed to secure judicial review orders, in the sense that the High Court gave us temporary orders quashing the decision of the cabinet minister, quashing the decision by the Energy Regulatory Commission, increasing the price of fuel products, incorporating in the same the VAT levy at 16%. And I may have taken this decision by the court lightly until sometimes around 6 months ago. I recall during the launch of the judiciary, I think it's the Justice and Administration Unit scorecard for the year 2019-2020, I believe, an event that took place at the Supreme Court and was graced by the President. And I remember during that session, the Chief Justice, actually, in addressing the President, just trying to outline the pain and the difficulty that the judiciary has to go through it because of its the cuts in the budget. And I cannot forget the rhetoric that came from the president, where President Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta came out emphatically and stated that, look, here you find judiciary which, when you want to raise taxes, they're the first ones to grant orders of injunction, and then again they're the ones now who are crying, seeking for more funds from the treasury. And in sense, the president was wondering where the money would come from. Now, why is this personal historical experience important, even as we discuss this topic today? It is critical because one of the core points that comes out from that case, and I want all my audience to realize, is just how important and how crucial courts are, and just how courts can make important decisions that can go as far as countermanding, correcting, placing a check on executive decisions through the application of what in law we refer to as judicial review orders. And I want to point out that even as a country today, as we experience the tiff between the judiciary and the executive in respect of the appointments of the 41 judges, as well as the budget to the judiciary, it is important for us to realize that this is one question that it's not just alien to Kenya. It's not that that's a scenario that is only experienced in Kenya. It's important to note that even other jurisdictions that we have thought or we believe to be much more experienced, jurisdictions that we believe to be much more modern, have also gone through some of these steps, and of course over a long period of time they have found a way through which they've crafted solutions and had established judiciaries which are known to be independent, are known to stand their ground, but also somehow also find a way in which to operate properly and convincingly with the executive. And to address the question today, I just want us to look at some happenings within the American jurisdiction, then I'll move to the United Kingdom jurisdiction, and of course ultimately we will sum it up with our jurisdiction in Kenya. Now, if I start with the American jurisdiction, let me start by pointing out that there is a sense in which the judicial review power of the judiciary in the United States has come under keen scrutiny from different arms, and particularly from the executive arm of the government. In fact, before I go far, you can all recall when President Donald Trump just took over, and he immediately started to enforce some of his major policy items, amongst others the one on limitation of immigration to the United States, the limitation when it comes to travel bans in respect of immigrants. You recall that's one question that raised a lot of storm in that country, and there are various states that moved the federal government to court seeking to injunct that particular position by the president. And in fact, there were injunctions that were issued by various federal courts against that presidential order, against that presidential decree. And the major argument that the president then brought in, and the major question that came in, was to what extent can the judiciary, as it were, in as much as it's independent, to what extent should it be allowed to move to quash a decision by a president who is simply implementing a manifesto through which he was elected by the people. Of course, as you are all aware, in the end of the day, the United States Supreme Court, through a 5-4 majority, gave a finding in favor of the president, as it were, allowing the process, but then putting the thresholds which the president has to follow even as he arrives at that sort of as he implements that contentious policy. Now, within that American jurisdiction, there are steps that have been created historically, and these steps have, in a way, helped to bring that, what I would call, a counterbalance of the judiciary, so that then it cannot be seen that the judiciary, though unelected in this democracy, seems to exercise so much power, even against an executive that is directly elected by the people. And what are some of these steps that have been taken to ensure that balance? Of course, the first one, and that's what's normally very important even when you are talking of the doctrine of independence of the judiciary, is in the aspect of appointment of federal judges. Now, it will be important to realize that within that jurisdiction, the appointment of federal judges is expressly a political process, in the sense that appointments are done by the president, who subsequently submits the names to the Senate, which would then vote and endorse the same or otherwise. So that in a sense, the process of appointment of judges in that particular jurisdiction can be said to be, without prejudice, a purely political process. And within the same jurisdiction, the argument that is put in place insofar as the checks and balances is concerned is that that mode of appointment has brought in a scenario where it can then be said that there is that aspect of democracy in the appointment of judges, in the sense that it is done by people who are democratically elected, so that that aspect of checks and balances, at least from within that jurisdiction, is explained as much. You will also realize that other than in the aspect of appointment, the same also plays out, that is the aspect of balance when it comes to the format of decision making by the bench. And you realize, like I mentioned earlier about the Supreme Court decision, which was 5-4, whenever judges arrive at decisions, those decisions have to be explained. They must come with reasons as to why they arrive at a decision, so that in a sense that ensures that the decisions by the judges are not arbitrary. Yeah, there's a sense in which you have to explain the reason as to why you arrived at that decision, so that in a sense these are systematic. These are checks and balances upon the operations of the judiciary, which are ingrained from the fashion through which judicial decisions are made. Within the same jurisdiction, the aspect of checks and balances is also established from within the context of how decisions are arrived at, especially when a wider bench is empaneled. And the mere fact that in the end of the day, notwithstanding the fact that you may have majority decisions and what we call the dissenting decisions, the fact that in the end of the day the majority decision holds sway, the fact that in the end of the day all the entire bench will come up with one decision as a corporate entity, that alone is seen as a way of also conferring aspects of checks and balances, because there's a sense in which the dissenting decision will also somehow be poking holes on the majority decision. And remember, the entire findings, the entire decisions are out there for the public at large to read and see. So that is also a way in which checks and balances upon the judiciary within that jurisdiction also comes into play. And finally, another way through which checks are also placed, and that is so fundamental, is on the discretion of the Chief Justice insofar as determination of, judges who will handle particular matters, and especially where we are talking of constituting the bench that will handle technical matters. And you realize that this is a very critical area, because one of the major debates that have happened within the American jurisdiction is the fact that particular chief justices, in ensuring that their preferences hold sway, have tended to, pick particular judges that, are oriented maybe in some particular fashion in terms of ideology, in terms of conviction, so that in the end of the day, the policy preferences of the Chief Justice might end up gaining sway in terms of policy issues. And you realize that this is a very critical role of the Chief Justice in exercising what I would describe as his executive authority within the judiciary, where he is the chief executive officer. It is a power through which, in one way or another, can be used to exert governmental influence governmental policy, especially on matters contentious, when it comes to contentious policies and issues. Other than those provisions that I have cited, that within that jurisdiction can be said to cement independence of the judiciary, I think it's also important to note that the individual personality of the justices that have been appointed within that jurisdiction, and further, the fact that within the American jurisdiction, the judges enjoy life tenure. In other words, unlike in Kenya, where the judgeship is for some time frame and you have to retire subsequently, within that jurisdiction, your judgeship is a life tenure. It's until you die, of course, unless you choose to resign or you are impeached. And so you realize that there is a sense in which, because of longevity of the judges, there's a sense in which then the aspect of political control, notwithstanding the fact that the appointment procedure is political, the longevity aspect brings in that notion of independence. And that is key when you realize, when we take the example of certain core players within the American judiciary, you will note from the example of the former Chief Justice, and that was John Marshall, who was a Chief Justice for around 34 years. And you will realize that John Marshall is credited with the, the robustness of the American judiciary, particularly when it comes to matters judicial review, which has caused the American judiciary to play a critical role in terms of policy formulation by correcting, or rather, checking executive actions. Also along the same line, we also find major players, the likes of also the former Chief Justice, he was called Wilson Howard Hart, now Wilson Howard Taft, who also subsequently became the President of the United States, and is credited so much in terms of the reforms that he brought within the judiciary, and to cement the place of the judiciary within that system. And it is said that some of the major qualities that these people had, and I have the example of Marshall, that this is a Chief Justice who was so compassionate. He had, he was so good at persuasion. He was so good at, involving his entire bench, and, even convincing, so that he took advantage of this knack just to place the American judiciary to a different level. Of course, you also have to look into the fact that within that jurisdiction, in as much as the election process may be, the appointment process may be political, but as a matter of fact, the persons that are vested into office must be those of high integrity, those of high qualification. And these persons have enabled the judiciary within the American jurisdiction to be one of a kind, and that also gives some very outstanding decisions which, are authoritative and form persuasive authority in so many other jurisdictions. I also want to look at the British system, and the United Kingdom system is crucial, bearing in mind that Kenya was a colony of the United Kingdom, and in fact a good number of Kenyan laws were actually imported, of course, before we crafted them and domesticated the same to suit our local circumstances. Now, one interesting thing within this jurisdiction is how the appointment clause has also been put in place, and how attempts have been made to ensure that they say there's that balance between the political aspect and the fact that merit and quality is merit, quality, and integrity is looked into when it comes to the appointment of judges. And you'll realize that within that jurisdiction they have what is called a judicial appointment commission, of course a replica of our judicial service commission. But what is important about this commission is that it is constituted by the Lord Chancellor. And who is the Lord Chancellor? Now, the Lord Chancellor essentially is it's more or less like he sits in the cabinet. Actually, is the cabinet secretary in charge of justice and constitutional affairs, though the office, as we'll realize, also has got it has got that historical leaning, in the sense that it developed out of the Court of Chancery, the court that was known to have developed the principles, the doctrines of equity, that has enabled us to enjoy like the injunctions that we ordinarily grafted within our jurisdiction. The thing is, those were principles that were created and developed by the Court of Chancery, then as headed by the Lord Chancellor. Now, as the UK stands now, the Lord Chancellor sits within the cabinet, also holding the office of Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Constitutional Affairs, and his core mandate is that he is the custodian of the rule of law. In fact, to be precise, the Lord Chancellor is expected to act as the bulwark within the executive against, the bulwark within the executive that protects the rule of law and that ensures the sustenance of independence of the judiciary. But what is important is that he sits within the cabinet. He is a cabinet secretary. Now, in respect to appointment of judges within the UK jurisdiction, one important point which I would also want us, and especially Kenyans, to reflect on is the fact that the Lord Chancellor is the one that would constitute the Judicial Appointments Commission. Secondly, in carrying out the process of recruitment, it is envisaged that the commission would consult widely with the Lord Chancellor. And thirdly, even after having arrived at choices, after having completed the recruitment process, the Judicial Appointments Commission is expected to forward the names to the Lord Chancellor, who is to look into them. And he has the option: he can accept or he can reject. If the Lord Chancellor accepts the same, then of course they shall be forwarded to the Prime Minister, who shall then recommend the same to the Queen as it stands now, and the Queen would ultimately appoint by way of gazettement and swearing in of the judges. Now, what is important, and which I also want us to relook vis-a-vis our context in Kenya, based on the issue that we have had, you realize that within that jurisdiction, there is a sense in which the commission in charge of the recruitment does not seem to have that open hand in terms of determining who, in terms of determining with authority who shall ultimately become the judge. There's a sense in which that decision can be countermanded by the Lord Chancellor, who sits within the cabinet. Of course, we also have to remember that in terms of the respect for the rule of law within that jurisdiction, in terms of the history, how the Court of Chancery has developed, how the office of the Lord Chancellor has developed, then by practice it has been done in such a way that one would not ordinarily expect the Lord Chancellor to apply purely political motives in ascertaining and in determining whether to accept or otherwise a choice that has been fronted by the Judicial Appointments Commission. Now, finally, I want us to come to our jurisdiction, the Kenyan jurisdiction. Now, in Kenya by now, we must have known, because this is a topic that has been trending for quite some time, that matters independence of the judiciary and how to sustain the same are substantively addressed within our constitution. In fact, if you look at Article 160 of our constitution expressly provides that the judiciary shall be independent and shall not be subject to authority from any other organ or any other source. The same constitution also goes further to express how that independence is to be achieved practically, for example, and that is core when it comes to appointment of the judges. You realize that the same is in two fashions. If you look at Article 166, in the first place, when it comes to the appointment of the Chief Justice and the Deputy Chief Justice, of course, in as much as the entire process is left to the Judicial Service Commission, ultimately upon appointment, the name being recommended to the President, the same also has to be vouched for, and it has to be vouched for by the National Assembly, which will have the option to accept or to reject the name, so that in a sense, and that is from my personal perspective, in this I see a sense in which we somehow borrowed the American style of thinking, so that then whoever is appointed to the position of the Chief Justice and the position of the Deputy Chief Justice can be said to have been, in as much as he was not, he or she is not elected, but that individual can be said to have been subjected to a democratic process, in the sense that their nomination was vouched for by one, of course, there is the President in the end of the day, but more fundamentally by the National Assembly that is composed of elected representatives of the people of Kenya. More fundamental within the same article is the appointment of judges, who you will realize does not have to be subjected to the parliamentary process, but the position is that, and that is the law, that once the Judicial Service Commission has recommended a candidate, a person to, as recommended, once the Judicial Service Commission has done its part, then it needs to recommend the requisite names to the President, and our courts have authoritatively stated that the President's hands are now tied after that, and all he needs to do is just to appoint, swear, and arrange gazettement. And of course, this is an issue that has raised a lot of questions, and it's important to realize that this is not the first time that the President has an issue with selections from the Judicial Service Commission. Remember, it also happened sometimes back in 2014, where the president took more than 1 year to actually appoint judges that had already been selected, and that position caused the Law Society of Kenya to move to court, and the court authoritatively addressed itself on this issue. In fact, to be precise, it is important to note that the major point of determination, the crucial point that the courts were asked to address their minds to, and which is still the position even now, and it's important to note that that was it occasioned the empaneling of a 5-judge bench. The question was, what did the framers of the Constitution envisaged when they, when in the draft realized that within the context of this country, bearing in mind part of the losing side were emphatic that they were 100% sure that they will not attain Constitution enshrined and ensured and safeguarded the independence of the Judicial Service Commission. You will also realize on the aspect of independence, finally, and that you'll find under Article 172, and I believe was 173, the aspect of the judiciary funding. Now, this is a critical area because even in the story that I gave as I started this presentation, I talked of the aspect of the Chief Justice requesting the President for more funds. And the framers of the Constitution emphasized this and therefore created the aspect of a judicial fund, the judiciary fund that would be managed solely by the judiciary. However, a keen look at this provision still would demonstrate some loophole. And why do I say so? Because you'll realize that in as much as the registrar of the judiciary is expected to present the budgetary estimates proposals from the judiciary, the same of course is subsequently presented to Parliament, and in Parliament we know there is the Parliamentary Budget and Appropriations Committee, which will relook those presentations, and of course in the end of the day can even choose to review, to revise the same. And as a matter of fact, that is what Parliament has done to the judiciary. Yeah, so that in the end of the day, the Kenyan judiciary finds itself in a scenario where it cannot have funds to enable it meet its obligations in terms of dispensation of justice. Yeah, so that in the end of the day, I can say authoritatively that the framers of the Kenyan Constitution, when they crafted the formula of appointment of the members of the Kenyan judiciary and opted to vest the same strictly on an independent commission, the Judicial Service Commission, when they crafted the aspect of the judiciary fund, which was expected to be independent, the sum total of this would best reflect the sum total of this would then cause and ought to cause Kenyans to frown at the deliberate attempt that we are now seeing by the executive to seek to, stymie operations of the judiciary. And in conclusion, I would want to say that within the context of our country, Kenya, even as we approach the potential change in our constitution, I know we have measured so much on the executive structure of government, but given the current tiff between the executive and the judiciary, one of my recommendations would be that the aspect of the judiciary fund under Article 173, there ought to be an amendment so that proposals by the registrar of the judiciary in terms of budget must be such that the parliament must not be given sway to be in a position to revise the proposals that have been given by the judiciary, because in a way then we find that parliament as an organ now is seen to have authority over the judiciary, and by extension, of course, the executive, because as we always know, the parliamentary committees are an express province and operate under the authority of the executive, bearing in mind that it's political parties that in the end of the day produce the leadership within the executive structure of government. So I think that is one area that really needs to be relooked in terms of an amendment when we shall be thinking of changing our constitution. Ladies and gentlemen, I think with that, let us have a brutal relook into this debate that is ongoing. Let us have a sober, very sober and open-minded discussion insofar as this issue is concerned, because it goes into the root of our structure of our constitution, when there seems to be a deliberate assault on a core arm of the government that plays a critical role in terms of keeping the executive family under check. Thank you.